Hi guys, how's it going? So my name's Joe. This is Malachi. This is my boy.
Hi.
So today, what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be reading through this book, which is Mortal Engines by Philip Reeve. Um, we'll see how far we'll do this book. There's three other books as well, so we'll see how far we get. I'm going to do a chapter or two at a time, okay? And they should be coming out twice a week for you guys. Chapter one is called The Hunting Grounds. It was a dark, blustery afternoon in spring, and the city of London was chasing a small mining town across the dried-out bed of the old North Sea. In happier times, London would never have bothered with such feeble prey. The great traction city had once spent its days hunting far bigger towns than this, ranging as far north as the edges of the ice wastes and south to the shores of the Mediterranean. But lately, prey of any kind had been started to grow scarce, and some of the larger cities had begun to look hungrily at London. For 10 years now it had been hiding from them, sulking in the damp, mountainous western district, which the Guild of Historians had said had once been the island of Britain. For 10 years it had eaten nothing but tiny farming towns and static settlements in those wet hills. Now at last the Lord Mayor had decided that the time was right to take the city back over the land bridge to the great hunting grounds. It was barely halfway across when the lookouts on the high watchtowers spied a mining town gnawing at the salt flats 20 miles ahead. To the people of London it seemed like a sign from the gods, and even the Lord Mayor, who didn't believe in gods or signs, thought it was a good beginning of the journey east, and issued the order to give chase. The mining town saw the danger and turned tail, but already huge caterpillar tracks under London were starting to roll faster and faster. Soon the city lumbering in hot pursuit. Soon the city was lumbering in hot pursuit, a moving mountain of metal which rose in seven-tiered layers like a wedding cake. The lower levels, the lower levels wreathed in engine smoke, the villas of the rich, gleaming white on the higher deck, and above all, the cross on top of St. Paul's Cathedral glittering gold, 2,000 feet above the ruined earth. Tom was cleaning the exhibits in the London Museum's Natural History section when it started. He felt the telltale tremor of the metal in the metal floor and looked up to find the model whales and dolphins that hung from the gallery roof swinging on the cables with soft creaking sounds. He wasn't alarmed. He'd lived in London for all of his 15 years, and he was used to its movements. He knew that the city was changing course and putting on speed. A prickle of excitement ran through him, the ancient thrill of the hunt that all Londoners shared. There must be prey in sight. Dropping his brushes and dusters, he pressed his hand to the wall, sensing the vibrations that came rippling up from the huge engine rooms down in the gut. Yep, there it was, the deep throb of the auxiliary motors cutting in, boom, 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 like a big drum beating inside his bones. The door at the far end of the gallery slammed open, and Chudley Pomroy came storming in, his toupee askew and his round face red with indignation. "What in the name of Quirk?" he blustered, gawping at the gyrating whales and the stuffed birds jiggling and twitching in their cases as if they were shaking off long captivity and getting ready to take wing again. "Apprentice Natsworthy, what's going on here?" "It's a chase, sir," said Tom, wondering how the deputy head of the Guild of Historians had managed to live aboard London for so long and still not recognise its heartbeat. "It must be something good," he explained. "They've bought all the auxiliaries online. This hasn't happened for ages. Maybe London's luck has turned." "Pah!" snorted Pomeroy, wincing at the glass in the display case. Wincing as the glass in the display cases started to whine and shiver in sympathy with the beat of the engines. Above his head, the biggest of the models, a thing called a blue whale that had become extinct thousands of years ago, was jerking back and forth on its hawsers like a plank swing. "That may be, Natsworthy," he said. "I just wish the Guild of Engineers would find some decent shock absorbers in this building. Some of these specimens are very delicate. It won't do. It won't do at all." He tugged a spotted handkerchief out of the folds of the long black robes that he wore and dabbed his face with it. "Please, sir," asked Tom, "could I run down to the observation platform and watch the chase, just for half an hour? It's been years since there was a really good one." Pomeroy looked shocked. "Certainly not, apprentice. Look at all this dust this wretched chase is shaking down. All the exhibits will have to be cleaned again and checked for damage." "Oh, but that's not fair," cried Tom. "I've just dusted the whole gallery." He knew at once that he'd made a mistake. Old Chudley Pomeroy wasn't a bad guildsman as it went, but he didn't like being answered back by a mere third-class apprentice. He drew himself to his full height, which was only slightly more than his full width, and frowned so sternly that his guild mark almost vanished between his bushy eyebrows. "Life isn't fair, Natsworthy," he boomed. "Any more cheek from you and you'll be on gut duty as soon as the chase is over." Of all the horrible chores that a third-class apprentice had to perform, gut duty was the one that Tom hated the most. He quickly shut up, staring meekly down at the beautiful buffed toes of the chief curator's boots. "You were told to work in this department until 7 o'clock, and you will work until 7 o'clock," Pomeroy went on. "Meanwhile, I shall consult the other curators about this dreadful, dreadful shaking." He hurried off, still muttering. Tom watched him go, then picked up his gear and went miserably back to work. Usually he didn't mind cleaning, especially not in this gallery, with its amiable, moth-eaten animals and the blue whale smiling its big blue smile. If he grew bored, he simply took refuge in a daydream in which he was a hero who rescued beautiful girls from air pirates, saved London from the Anti-Traction League, and lived happily ever after. But how could he daydream with the rest of the city enjoying the first proper chase for ages? He waited for 20 minutes, but Chudley Pomeroy did not return. There was no one else about. It was a Wednesday, which meant the museum was closed to the public, and most of the senior guildsmen and first and second-class apprentices would be having the day off. What harm would it do if he slipped outside for 10 minutes, just to see what was happening? He hid his bag of cleaning stuff behind a handy yak and hurried out through the shadow of the dancing dolphins to the door. Out in the corridor, all of the argon lamps were dancing too, spilling their light up the metal walls. Two black-robed guildsmen hurried past, and Tom heard the reedy voice of old Dr. Arkengarth whine, "Vibrations, vibrations, it's playing merry hell with my 35th century ceramics." He waited until they had vanished around the bend in the corridor, then slipped quickly out and down the nearest stairway. He cut through the 21st century gallery, past the big plastic statues of Pluto and Mickey, animal-headed gods in Lost America. He ran across the main hall and down galleries full of things that had somehow survived through all the millennia since the ancients had destroyed themselves in that terrible flurry of orbit-to-Earth atomic and tailored virus bombs called the 60-Minute War. 2 minutes later, he slipped out through a side entrance into the noise and bustle of Tottenham Court Road. The London Museum stood at the very hub of Tier 2, in a busy district called Bloomsbury, and the underbelly of Tier 1 hung like a rusty sky a few feet above the rooftops. Tom didn't worry about being spotted as he pushed his way along the dark, crowded streets towards the public goggle screens outside Tottenham Court Road elevator station. Joining the crowds in front of it, he had his first glimpse of the distant prey, a watery, blue-grey blur captured by cameras down on Tier 6. "The town is called Salt Hook," boomed the voice of the announcer. "A mining platform of 900 inhabitants. She is currently moving at 80 miles per hour, heading due east, but the Guild of Navigators predicts that London will catch her before sundown. There is sure to be many more towns awaiting us beyond the land bridge. Clear proof of just how wise our beloved Lord Mayor was when he decided to bring London east again." 80 miles per hour, thought Tom in awe. It was an astonishing speed, and he longed to be down on the observation deck, feeling the wind on his face. He was probably already in trouble with Mr. Pomeroy. What difference does it make if he stole a few more minutes? He set off at a run, and soon reached Bloomsbury Park. Out in the open air on the tier's brim, It had been a proper park once, with trees and duck ponds, but because of all the recent shortage of prey, it had been given over to food production, and its lawns grubbed up to make way for cabbage plots and algae pans. The observation platforms were still there, though, raised balconies jutting over the edge of the tier where Londoners could go to watch the passing view. Tom hurried to the nearest. An even bigger crowd had gathered there, including quite a few people in the black of the Historians' Guild, and Tom tried to look as inconspicuous as he could as he pushed his way through to the front and peered over the railings. Salt Hook was only 5 miles ahead, travelling flat out with black smoke spewing from its exhaust stacks. "Natsworthy!" called a braying voice, and his heart sank. He looked around and found that he was standing next to Melephant, a burly first-class apprentice who grinned at him and said, "Isn't it wonderful? A flat little salt mining platform with C-20 land engines, just what London needs." Herbert Melephant was the worst sort of bully, the sort that didn't just hit you and stick your head down the lavatory, but made it his business to find out all of your secrets and all of the things that upset you the most and taunt you with them. He enjoyed picking on Tom, who was small and shy and had no friends to stick up for him, and Tom could not get back at him because Melephant's family had paid to make him a first-class apprentice, while Tom, who had no family, was a mere third. He knew Melephant was only bothering to talk to him because he was hoping to impress a pretty young historian named Clytie Potts, who was standing just behind. Tom looked and turned back, concentrating on the chase. "Look!" shouted Clytie Potts. The gap between London and its play was narrowing fast, and the dark shapes had lifted clear of Salt Hook. Soon there was another and another. Airships! The crowd on London's observation platform cheered, and Melephant said, "Ah, air merchants! They know that their town's doomed, you see, and they're making sure they get away before we eat it. If they don't, we can claim their cargoes along with everything else aboard." Tom was glad to see that Clytie Potts looked thoroughly bored by Melephant. She was a year above him and must already know this stuff, because she had passed her guild exam and had the historian's mark tattooed on her forehead. "Look," she said again, catching Tom's glance and grinning. "Oh, look at them go. Aren't they beautiful?" Tom pushed his untidy hair out of his eyes and watched as the airships rose up and vanished into the slate-grey clouds. For a moment he found himself longing to go with them, up into the sunlight. If only his poor parents had not left him to the care of the guild, to be trained as an historian. He wished he could be a cabin boy aboard a sky clipper and see all the cities of the world, Porto Angeles adrift on the blue Pacific, and Archangel skating on iron runners across the frozen northern seas, the great ziggurat towns of the Nouveau Mayans, and the unmoving strongholds of the Anti-Traction League. But that was just a daydream, better saved for some dull museum afternoon. A fresh outbreak of cheering warned him that the chase was nearing its end, and he forgot the airships and turned attention back to Salt Hook. The little town was so close that he could see ant-like shapes of people running about on its upper tiers. How frightened they must be, with London bearing down on them and nowhere to hide. But he knew he mustn't feel sorry for them. It was natural that cities ate towns, just as towns ate smaller towns, and smaller towns snapped up the miserable static settlements. That was municipal Darwinism, and that was the way the world had worked for 1,000 years, ever since the great engineer Nicholas Quirk had turned London into the first traction city. "London, London!" he shouted, adding his voice to the cheer and the shouts of everyone else on the platform. And a moment later they were rewarded by the sight of one of Salt Hook's wheels breaking loose. The town slew to a halt, smokestacks snapping off and crashing down into the panicked streets, and then London's lower tiers blocking it from view, and Tom felt the deck plates shivering as the city's huge hydraulic jaws came slamming shut. There was a frantic cheering from observation platforms all over the city. Loudspeakers on the tier support pillars started to play London Pride, and somebody Tom had never ever seen before hugged him tight and shouted in his ear, "A catch! A catch!" He didn't mind. At that moment he loved everyone on the platform, even Melephant. "A catch!" he yelled back, struggling free, and felt the deck plates tremble again. Somewhere below him the city's great steel teeth were gripping Salt Hook, lifting it and dragging it backwards into the gut. And perhaps Apprentice Natsworthy would like to come as well, Clytie Potts was saying. Tom had no idea what she was talking about, but as he turned, she touched his arm and smiled. There'll be celebrations in Kensington Gardens tonight, she explained. Dancing and fireworks. Do you want to come? People didn't usually invite a third-class apprentice to parties, especially not people as pretty and popular as Clytie, and Tom wondered at first if she was making fun of him. But Maleficent obviously didn't think so, for he tugged her away and said, We don't want Natsworthy's sort there. Why not? Asked the girl. Well, you know, huffed Maleficent, his square face turning almost as red as Mr. Pomeroy's. He's just the third, a skivvy. He'll never get his guild mark. He'll just end up as a curator's assistant, won't you, Natsworthy? He asked, leering at Tom. It's a pity your dad didn't leave you enough money for a proper apprenticeship. That's none of your business, shouted Tom angrily. His elation at the catch had evaporated, and he was on edge again, wondering what punishment would be in store when Pomeroy found that he had sneaked away. He was in no mood for Maleficent's taunts. Still, that's what comes from living in the slums on the lower tiers, I suppose, smirked Maleficent, turning back to Clytie Potts. Natsworthy's mum and dad lived down on 4, see? And when the big tilt happened, they both got squashed flat as a couple of raspberry pancakes. Splat. Tom didn't mean to hit him. It just happened. Before he knew what he was doing, his hand was curled into a tight fist and he lashed out. Ow! Wailed Maleficent, so startled that he fell over backwards. Someone cheered, and Clytie stifled a giggle. Tom just stood staring at his trembling fist and wondering how he had done it. But Maleficent was much bigger and tougher than Tom, and he was already back on his feet. Clytie tried to restrain him, but some other historians were cheering him on, and a group of boys in the green tunics of apprentice navigators clustered close behind and chanted, Fight, fight, fight! Tom knew he stood no more a chance against Maleficent than Salthook had stood against London. He took a step backwards, but the crowd was hemming him in. Then Maleficent's fist hit him on the side of his face, and Maleficent's knee crashed upwards between his legs, and he was bent double and stumbling away with his eyes full of tears. Something as big and softly yielding as a sofa stood in his way, and as he rammed his head against it, it said, Oof! He looked up into a round, red, bushy-eyebrowed face under an unconvincing wig, a face that grew even redder when it recognised him. Natsworthy! Bloomed Chudley Pomeroy. What in Quirk's name do you think you're playing at? And that's the end of chapter 1. Should we read one more? You enjoying it? No? You don't want to read one more now?
I'm not sure.
What do you reckon, guys? Should we read one more? What do you reckon, Mandy? One more? Stop now.
I'm not sure.
You don't know?
No, I'm not sure.
Are you enjoying it?
Yeah.
Yeah? Okay, we'll read one more. Chapter 2 is called Valentine. And so Tom found himself being sent off to do gut duty, while all the other apprentices were busy celebrating the capture of Salthook. After a long, embarrassing lecture in Pomeroy's office, disobedience, Natsworthy, striking a senior apprentice. What would your poor parents have thought? He trudged over to Tottenham Court Road Station and waited for a down elevator. When it came, it was crowded. The seats in the upper compartment were packed with arrogant-looking men and women from the Guild of Engineers, the most powerful of the 4 great guilds which ran London. They gave Tom the creeps with their bald heads and those long white rubber coats that they wore, so he stayed standing in the lower section, where the stern face of the Lord Mayor stared down at him from posters saying, Movement is life. Help the Guild of Engineers keep London moving. Down and down went the elevator, stopping at all the familiar stations, Bakerloo, High Holborn, Low Holborn, Bethnal Green. And at every stop another crowd of people surged into the car, squashing him against the back wall until it was almost a relief to reach the bottom and step out into the noise and bustle of the gut. The gut was where London dismantled the towns it caught. A stinking sprawl of yards and factories between the jaws and the central engine room. Tom loathed it. It was always noisy, and it was stuffed by workers from the lower tiers, who were dirty and frightened, and convicts from deep gut prison who were worse. The heat down there always gave him a headache, and the sulphurous air made him sneeze, and the flicker of argon globes which lit the walkways hurt his eyes. But the Guild of Historians always made sure that some of its staff were on hand when a town was being digested, and tonight he would have to join them and go about reminding the tough old foreman of the gut that any books and antiques aboard a new catch were rightful property of his guild, and that history was just as important as bricks and iron and coal. He fought his way out of the elevator terminus and hurried towards the Guild of Historians warehouse, through tubular corridors lined with green ceramic tiles, and across metal catwalks high above the fiery gulf of the digestion yard. Far below him he could see Salthook being torn to pieces. It looked tiny now, dwarfed by the vastness of London. Big yellow dismantling machines were crawling all around it on tracks, and swinging above it on cranes, and clambering over it on hydraulic spider legs. Its wheels and axles had already been taken off, and work was starting on the chassis. Circular saws as big as Ferris wheels bit into the deck plates, throwing up plumes of spark. Great blasts of heat came billowing from furnaces and smelters, and before he had gone 20 paces, Tom could feel the sweat starting to soak through the armpits of his black uniform tunic. But when he finally reached the warehouse, things started to look a bit brighter. Salthook had not had a museum or a library, and the small heaps that had been salvaged from the town's junk shops were already being packed into crates for their journey up to Tier 2. If he was lucky, he might be allowed to finish early and catch the end of the celebrations. He wondered which guildsman was in charge tonight. If it was old Arkengarth or Dr. Weymouth, he was doomed. They always make you work your whole shift, whether there was anything to do or not. If it was Potty Pewtertide or Miss Plim, he might be all right. But as he hurried towards the supervisor's office, he began to realize that someone much more important than any of them was on gut duty tonight. There was a bug parked outside the office, a sleek black bug with the guild's emblem painted on its engine cowling. Much too flash for any of the usual staff. 2 men in the livery of high-ranking guild staff stood waiting beside it. They were rough-looking types, in spite of their plush clothes, and Tom knew at once who they were: Pusey and Gench, the reformed air pirates who had been the head historian's faithful servant for 20 years, and who piloted the 13th floor elevator, which is the name of a airship, whenever he flew off on expeditions. Valentine is here, thought Tom. He tried not to stare as he hurried past them up the steps. Thaddeus Valentine was Tom's hero, a former scavenger who had arisen to become London's most famous archaeologist, and also its head historian, much to the envy and disgust of people like Pomeroy. Tom kept a picture of him tacked to the dormitory wall above his bunk, and he had read his books, Adventures of a Practical Historian and American Deserter Across the Dead Continent with Gun, Camera and Airship, until he knew them by heart. The proudest moment of his life had been when he was 12 years old, and Valentine had come down to present the apprentices' end-of-year prizes, including the one that Tom had won for an essay on identifying false antiques. He still remembered every word of the speech the great man had made. "Never forget, apprentices, that we historians are the most important guild in our city. We don't make as much money as merchants, but we create knowledge which is worth a great deal more. We may not be responsible for steering London like the navigators, but where would the navigators be if we hadn't preserved the ancient maps and charts? And as far as the Guild of Engineers, just remember that every machine they have ever developed is based on some fragment of old tech, ancient technology that our museum keepers have preserved or our archaeologists have dug up." All Tom had been able to manage by way of a reply was a mumbled, "Thank you, sir," before he scurried back to his seat. So it never occurred to him that Valentine would remember him, but when he opened the door of the supervisor's office, the great man looked up from his desk and grinned. "It's Natsworthy, isn't it? The apprentice, so good at spotting fakes. I'll have to watch my step tonight, or you'll find me out." It wasn't much of a joke, but it broke through the awkwardness that usually existed between an apprentice and a senior guildsman, and Tom relaxed enough to stop hovering on the threshold and stepped right inside, holding out his note from Pomeroy. Valentine jumped to his feet and came striding over to take it. He was a tall, handsome man of nearly 40, with a mane of silver-flecked black hair and a trimmed black beard. His grey mariner's eyes twinkled with humour, and on his forehead a third eye, the gild mark of the historians, the blue eye that looked backwards into time, seemed to wink as he raised his quizzical eyebrow. Fighting, eh? And what did Apprentice Mullifant do to deserve a black eye? He was saying stuff about my mum and dad, sir, mumbled Tom. I see, the explorer nodded, watching the boy's face. Instead of telling him off, he asked, Are you the son of David and Rebecca Natsworthy? Yes, sir, Tom admitted, but I was only 6 when the big tilt happened. I mean, I don't really remember them. Valentine nodded again. His eyes were sad and kind. They were good historians, Thomas. I hope that you all follow in their footsteps. Oh, yes, sir, said Tom. I mean, I hope so too. He thought of his poor mum and dad, killed when part of Cheapside collapsed onto the tier below. No one had ever spoken like that about them before, and he felt his eyes filling with tears. He felt as if he could tell Valentine anything at all, and he was just on the point of saying how much he missed his parents and how lonely and boring it was being a third-class apprentice, when a wolf walked into the office. It was a very large wolf, and white, and it appeared through the door that led into the stockroom. As soon as Tom saw it, as soon as it saw Tom, it came running towards him, bearing its yellow fangs. Ah! He shrieked, leaping into the chair. A wolf! Oh, do behave, the girl's voice said. And a moment later, the girl herself was there, bending over the beast and tickling the soft white ruff of fur under its chin. The fierce amber eyes closed happily, and Tom heard its tail whisking against her clothes. Don't worry, she laughed, smiling at him. He's a lamb. I mean, he's a wolf, really, but he's as gentle as a lamb. Tom, said Valentine, his eyes twinkling with amusement, meet my daughter Catherine, and Dog. Dog? Tom came down off his chair, feeling foolish and still a little scared. He had thought the brute must have escaped from the zoo in Circle Park. It's a long story, said Valentine. Catherine lived on the raft city of Porto Angeles until she was 5. Then her mother died, and she was sent to live with me. I bought Dog back for her as a present from my explorations to the ice wastes, but Catherine couldn't speak very much English in those days, and she'd never heard of wolves, so when she first saw him, she said Dog, and it sort of stuck. He's perfectly tame, the girl promised, still smiling up at Tom. Father found him when he was just a cub. He had to shoot the mother, but he didn't have the heart to finish the poor dog off. He likes it best if you tickle his tummy. Dog, I mean, not father, she laughed. She had a lot of long dark hair, and her father's green eyes, and the same quick, dazzling smile. And she was dressed in the narrow silk trousers and flowery tunic that were all the rage in High London that summer. Tom gazed at her in wonder. He had seen pictures of Valentine's daughter, but he had never realised how beautiful she was. Look, she said, he likes you. Dog had ambled over to sniff at the hem of Tom's tunic. His tail swished from side to side, and a wet pink tongue rasped over Tom's fingers. If Dog likes people, said Catherine, I usually find I like them too. So come along, father, introduce us properly. Valentine laughed. Well, Katie, this is Tom, Natsworthy, who's been sent down here to help. And if your wolf has finished with him, I think we will have to let him get to work. He put a kindly hand on Tom's shoulder. There's not much to be done. We'll just take a last look around the yards, and then... He glanced up at the note from Pomeroy, then tore it into little pieces, and dropped them into the red recycling bin beside the desk. Then you can go. Tom was not sure what surprised him more, that Valentine was letting him off, or that he was coming down to the yard in person. Senior guildsmen usually preferred to sit in the comfort of the office, and let the apprentices do the hard work down in the heat and fumes, but here was Valentine, pulling off his black robes, clipping a pen into his pocket of his waistcoat, pausing to grin at Tom from the doorway. Come along then, he said. The sooner we start, the sooner you can get off to join the fun in Kensington Gardens. Down and down they went, with Dog and Catherine following, down past the warehouse and on down twisting spirals of metal stairs to the digestion yard, where Salthook was growing smaller by the minute. All that remained of it now was a steel skeleton and the machines were ripping even that apart, dragging deck plates and girders away to the furnace to be melted down. Meanwhile, mountains of brick and slate and timber and salt and coal were trundling off conveyor belts towards the heart of the gut, and skips of furniture and provisions were being wheeled clear by the salvage gangs. The salvage men were the true rulers of this part of London, and they knew it. They swaggered along in the narrow walkways with the agility of tomcats, their bare chests shiny with sweat and their eyes hidden by tinted goggles. Tom had always been frightened of them, but Valentine hailed them with an easy charm and asked them if they had seen anything amongst the spoils that might be of interest to the museum. Sometimes he would stop to joke with them or ask them how their families were doing, and he was always careful to introduce them to my colleague, Mr. Natsworthy. Tom felt himself swell with pride. Valentine was treating him like a grown-up, and so the salvage men treated him the same way, touching the peak of their greasy caps and grinning as they introduced themselves. They all seemed to be called Len or Smudger. Take no notice of what they say about those chaps up at the museum, warned Valentine, as one of the Lens led them to a skip where some antiques had been stowed. Just because they live down here in the borough and don't pronounce their H's doesn't mean they're fools. That's why I like to come down here in person when the yards are working. I've often seen salvagemen and scavengers turn up artifacts that historians might have missed. Yes, sir, agreed Tom, glancing at Catherine. He longed to do something that would impress the head historian and his beautiful daughter. If only he could find some wonderful fragment of old tech among this junk, something that would make them remember him after they had gone back to the luxury of high London. Otherwise, after this wander around the yards, he might never see them again. Hoping to amaze them, he hurried to the skip and looked inside. After all, old tech did turn up from time to time in small-town antique shops or on old ladies' mantelpieces. Imagine being the one to rediscover some legendary secret, like heavier-than-air flying machines or pot noodles. Even if it wasn't something that the Guild of Engineers could use, it might still end up being in the museum, labelled and preserved in a display case with a notice saying, "Discovered by Mr. T. Natsworthy." He peered hopefully at the heap of salvage in the skip. Shards of plastic, lampstands, a flattened toy ground car. A small metal box caught his eye. When he pulled it out and opened it, his own face blinked back at him, reflecting in a silvery plastic disc. "Mr. Valentine, look, a CD!" Valentine reached into the box and lifted out one of the discs, tilting it so that a rainbow light darted across its surface. "Quite right," he said. "The ancients used these in their computers as a way of storing information." "Could it be important?" asked Tom. Valentine shook his head. "I'm sorry, Thomas. The people of the old days may have once lived in static settlements, but their electronic machines were far beyond anything London engineers have been able to build. Even if there is still something stored on this disk, we have no way of reading it. But it's a good find. Keep hold of it just in case." He turned away as Tom put the CD back in its box and slid it into his pocket. But Catherine must have sensed Tom's disappointment, because she touched his hand and said, "It's lovely, Tom. Anything that survived all those thousands of years is lovely, whether it's of any use to the horrible old Guild of Engineers or not," she said. "I've got a necklace made of old computer disks." She smiled at him. She was as lovely as one of the girls in his daydreams, but kinder and funnier, and he knew that from now on the heroines he rescued in his imagination would all be Catherine Valentine. There was nothing else of interest in the skip. Salt Hook had been a practical sort of town, too busy gnawing at old seabeds to bother about digging up the past. But instead of going straight back to the warehouse, Valentine led his companions up another staircase and along a narrow catwalk to the incomers' station, where the former inhabitants were queuing to give their names to the clerk of administrations and be taken up to their new homes in the hostels and workhouses of London. "Even when I'm not on duty," he explained, "I always make a point of going down to see the scavengers when we make a catch, before they have the chance to sell their finds at the Tier 5 antique market and melt back into the out country." There was always some scavenger aboard a catch, townless wanderers who roamed the hunting grounds on foot, scratching up old pieces of old tech. Salthook was no exception. At the end of a long queue of dejected townsfolk stood a group more ragged than the rest, with long tattered coats that hung down to their ankles, and goggles and dust masks slung around their grubby necks. Like most Londoners, Tom was horrified by the idea that people still actually lived on the bare earth. He hung back with Catherine and Dog, but Valentine went over to speak with the scavengers. They came clustering around him, all except one, a tall, thin one in a black coat, a girl. Tom thought, although he could not be sure because she wore a black scarf wrapped around her face like a turban of a desert nomad. He stood near her and watched while Valentine introduced himself to the other scavengers and asked, "So, have any of you found anything the Historians Guild might wish to purchase?" Some of the men nodded, some shook their heads, some rummaged in their bulging packs. The girl in the black scarf slid one hand inside her coat and said, "I have something for you, Valentine." She spoke so softly that only Tom and Catherine heard her, and as they turned to look, she suddenly sprang forward, whipping out a long, thin, bladed knife. And that, guys, is where we're going to stop for today. If you enjoyed it, tune in again. I will be doing the next few chapters next time. So, yeah, let me know what you think. Comment below, and please share it with any friends that you think would like to hear the story. Mortal Engines, Philip Reeve will be back real soon.